March 1944, over the western Pacific high above scattered cloud layers, where the sky turns thin and pale. Sunlight glints off metal as two shapes converge at altitude. Below, the ocean stretches endlessly, broken only by distant island silhouettes. Engine noise dominates everything steady, mechanical, unforgiving. Japanese fighters move confidently through the airspace. Their pilots have seen this aircraft before. Large, heavy, too big to climb well. They call it clumsy, inferior, an opponent to be toyed with, not feared. Ahead of them, a lone American P-47 Thunderbolt levels briefly, its massive radial engine humming with restrained power. To the Japanese pilots, its size confirms what they believe. Weight is weakness. Speed belongs to lighter machines. Then the Thunderbolt pitches upward, not abruptly, not desperately, but with controlled intent. As seconds pass, something feels wrong. The distance does not close. The altitude gap does not shrink. Instead, the American fighter keeps rising steadily, relentlessly carrying its weight into thinner air where engines should falter. The Japanese pilots pull back on their controls, expecting the familiar advantage to appear. It doesn't. What? They are watching challenges everything they thought they knew about this aircraft. About weight, about climb, about who controls the vertical fight. And in that widening space between expectation and reality, confidence begins to fracture. Because this climb is not slowing, it is accelerating. By early 1944, the air war in the Pacific was no longer the conflict Japan had prepared for. In the opening years of the war, Japanese naval aviation had dominated the skies. Light, agile fighters, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, had overwhelmed Allied pilots across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. Speed, maneuverability, and long range defined Japanese success. In turning combat, the Zero was unmatched. But wars evolved by 1943. The strategic situation had shifted decisively. American industrial output surged. Pilot training pipelines expanded. New aircraft arrived in growing numbers, designed not for elegance, but for endurance, firepower, and survivability. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces no longer sought to outturn Japanese fighters. They sought to outclimb, outdive, and outlast them. This marked a fundamental change in air combat philosophy. Japanese doctrine emphasized close-range maneuver combat. Pilots were trained to win by feel-tight turns, quick reactions, intuitive flying. Early successes reinforced this mindset. Against lighter Allied aircraft, it worked, but doctrine hardened into expectation. As new American fighters appeared, Japanese pilots assessed them through familiar lenses. Size implied sluggishness. Weight implied poor climb. Radial engines implied inefficiency at altitude. These assumptions had held true before. They would not hold forever in the Central and Western Pacific. Japanese air units increasingly found themselves defending territory rather than striking outward. Airfields on island chains became launch points for interception rather than offense. Pilots scrambled to meet incoming formations, often climbing rapidly to altitude under pressure. Altitude now mattered. American bombers flew higher. Escorts climbed faster. Engagements increasingly unfolded in the vertical plane where power retention and energy management outweighed turning finesse. Japanese aircraft, optimized for low to medium altitude agility, struggled here. Their engines lost power rapidly. As air thinned, armor and self-sealing tanks had been sacrificed for range and maneuverability. What had once been advantages now imposed limits. Meanwhile, American fighters arriving in the Pacific brought different priorities. They were heavier, more robust, less graceful in a turn but capable of absorbing punishment and exploiting altitude. Their pilots were trained to fight in energy states, not circles. Among these aircraft was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Two Japanese observers looked absurd for Pacific combat. Too large, too heavy, too slow to climb. Its reputation preceded it not as a dogfighter, but as a brute designed for Europe. Mockery followed familiarity. But what Japanese pilots underestimated was not the Thunderbolt's agility. It was its power. And as encounters increased at higher altitudes in 1944, the gap between expectation and reality grew more dangerous by the day. Because the Pacific Air war was no longer about who turned tighter. It was about who controlled the sky above the fight. And that reality was about to become impossible to ignore. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be subtle. Designed around the largest engine ever fitted to a single-engine fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R280 OTHA aircraft prioritized raw power and survivability over elegance. Fully loaded, it outweighed most fighters in the Pacific by several tons. Its wings were broad, its fuselage thick, silhouette impossible to miss. Two Japanese pilots accustomed to light frames and razor-sharp turning performance, the Thunderbolt looked like a mistake. Early encounters reinforced that belief. At low altitude, the P-47 could not match the tight turning radius of the Mitsubishi A6M0. In horizontal maneuvering fights, the Zero still held the advantage. Japanese pilots saw Thunderbolts bleed speed quickly when forced into turns, and assumed the aircraft was fundamentally flawed. But this judgment missed the aircraft's defining feature, hidden within the P-47's massive fuselage was a turbo supercharger, engineering decision that transformed how the aircraft behaved at altitude. While most fighters relied on engine power that degraded sharply as air thinned, the Thunderbolt maintained near sea-level performance far above where Japanese engines began to struggle at altitude. The Thunderbolt did not lose strength, it gained it. The aircraft's climb rate improved dramatically once its turbo supercharger came fully into effect. What appeared slow and heavy near the surface became something entirely different above 20,000 feet. The P-47 could convert speed into altitude relentlessly, sustaining climbs that lighter aircraft simply could not follow. This contradicted visual intuition. Weight usually meant poor climb. Large radial engines usually meant inefficiency at altitude. Japanese pilots had been trained to trust these patterns, and for years, those patterns had held. But the Thunderbolt was built around breaking them. American training reflected this reality. P-47 pilots were taught to avoid turning engagements. They were drilled to fight vertically, diving with speed, climbing out of danger, and forcing opponents to choose between altitude and pursuit. Energy, not agility, was the currency of survival. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were still encouraged to press engagements based on turning superiority. Even as aircraft performance shifted, doctrine lagged behind reality. This mismatch created moments of shock. Zeros that followed Thunderbolts upward found their engines gasping for power. Controls grew sluggish. The aircraft lost energy faster than expected. Pilots accustomed to dominance suddenly found themselves below an enemy that refused to slow down. The Thunderbolt did not need to outturn the Zero. It needed only to outclimb. It dawned by early 1944. Those encounters were becoming more frequent. Japanese pilots began to report engagements where American fighters escaped upward, unapproachable, unreachable despite their apparent bulk. Mockery gave way to confusion, because something was wrong with the assumptions, and as those assumptions collapsed in the sky, pilots on both sides prepared for confrontations where belief would be tested not by reputation but by physics. Pilot confidence is a weapon and a liability. By 1944, many Japanese pilots entering combat had grown up on stories of early war dominance. They had learned to trust the Zero's lightness, its responsiveness, and the feeling of control it gave in a turning fight. Confidence was reinforced by experience. Lighter aircraft usually climbed poorly. Heavier aircraft usually struggled upward. These beliefs were not arrogance. They were pattern recognition. When Japanese pilots first encountered the Thunderbolt, that pattern seemed intact. The P-47 looked slow to respond at low altitude. It resisted tight turns. It bled speed when forced into horizontal maneuvering. These early impressions hardened quickly into dismissal. Mockery followed. Dismissal. Calling the Thunderbolt heavy was a way of reducing threat. If the enemy aircraft was clumsy, then it could be managed. If it could be managed, then it could be defeated. But air combat punished emotional shortcuts in the cockpit. Belief shaped reaction time. Pilots committed to pursuits they should have abandoned. They pulled into climbs they assumed they could sustain. They trusted muscle memory over changing conditions. The moment the Thunderbolt began to pull away vertically, that confidence fractured. What unsettled Japanese pilots was not just losing position, it was losing predictability. The aircraft they believed they understood began behaving in ways that contradicted experience. That uncertainty created hesitation, and hesitation at altitude was dangerous. Human factors mattered as much as performance. The Thunderbolt did not need to intimidate. It needed only to behave consistently in ways its opponent did not expect. As Japanese pilots watched a supposedly inferior aircraft climb beyond reach, the psychological balance shifted. Confidence, once shaken, was difficult to restore in midair, and as more pilots experienced the same outcome, disbelief spread faster than any official warning. Air combat in the Pacific increasingly became a contest of energy. Japanese tactics favored horizontal maneuvering, tight turns, scissors, and sustained engagements designed to bleed an opponent's speed until a firing solution emerged. Against early Allied fighters, this approach had been devastatingly effective. The P-47 rewrote those rules. American pilots avoided turning fights entirely. Instead, they emphasized vertical maneuvering, diving attacks, followed by steep climbs, forcing opponents to choose between pursuit and survival. This approach relied on power retention, not agility, in a vertical fight. Weight mattered differently. A heavier aircraft with more power could convert speed into altitude more efficiently. The Thunderbolt's massive engine and turbo supercharger allowed it to maintain thrust where lighter engines faded. Once climbing, it could keep climbing. Japanese pilots who followed vertically found themselves at a disadvantage almost immediately. Their aircraft lost speed rapidly. Control inputs became sluggish. The climb angle flattened tactically. This created a trap. Pursuing the Thunderbolt upward meant surrendering energy. Breaking off meant ceding altitude. Either choice favored the American pilot, who could then re-engage from above or disengage entirely. The Thunderbolt dictated terms. This was not about winning every engagement. It was about controlling when and how combat happened. Japanese pilots accustomed to initiating fights suddenly found themselves reacting. As these encounters repeated, Zero squadrons were forced to reconsider pursuit doctrines that had once been. Automatic vertical space had become contested and the Thunderbolt owned it. The Thunderbolt's advantage was not mysterious, it was mechanical. The turbo supercharger allowed the engine to compress thin air at altitude, delivering consistent power where other engines faltered. This meant the aircraft could maintain climb rate and acceleration far above the Zero's optimal performance envelope. Japanese engines lacked this capability. As altitude increased, available power dropped sharply. The Zero's lightweight design, once its greatest strength, became a limitation. Without armor or power reserves, there was little margin for prolonged vertical pursuit. Weight, paradoxically, became an asset. The Thunderbolt's mass gave it momentum. Once climbing, it resisted deceleration. Its robust structure tolerated high-speed dives and aggressive pull-ups that lighter aircraft could not safely match. Technology reshaped outcomes silently. Pilots felt the effect before they understood it. Controls grew heavy. Engines lost responsiveness. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, kept pulling upward with steady confidence. This was not superiority in all conditions. At low altitude and in turning fights, the Zero still held advantages. Combat no longer stayed where Japanese pilots preferred it. Technology forced the fight upward, and in that vertical space, appearances deceived. The aircraft that looked wrong for the Pacific proved perfectly suited for a new kind of air war, one governed by physics rather than perception. As these angles converged, human belief, tactical choice, and mechanical reality, stage was set for confrontations where misunderstanding would turn into shock. Doctrine shapes instinct. For Japanese fighter leaders, doctrine had been forged in early victories. Aggressive pursuit, close engagement, turning dominance. These principles had produced results against opponents who could not match agility or pilot experience. By 1944, those principles were under strain. Leadership recognized that American aircraft were changing, but doctrine adapted slowly. Training syllabi emphasized familiar engagements. Briefings still assumed that lighter fighters could outmaneuver heavier ones. Vertical disengagement was discussed but not prioritized. American leadership moved faster. U.S. pilots flying the Thunderbolt were trained explicitly to reject turning fights. Squadrons drilled energy management relentlessly. Pilots were taught to trust altitude and speed more than instinct. Breaking off upward was not retreated, was repositioning. This difference in leadership philosophy mattered. Japanese pilots who encountered Thunderbolts climbing away faced a dilemma their doctrine did not resolve. Should they pursue and risk stalling at altitude, or should they break off and concede airspace? Neither option aligned with training that rewarded aggression as encounters accumulated. Frontline leaders began issuing informal cautions: avoid vertical pursuits, disengage. Earlier, conserve energy. But these adjustments were uneven, filtered through experience rather than enforced systematically. Doctrine lagged reality in air combat. That lag cost lives. Leadership on the American side reinforced success quickly. Pilots who survived by using altitude were validated. Those who attempted turning engagements were corrected or did not return. The result was asymmetry. One side adapted through instruction, the other adapted through loss. And as more, zero squadrons encountered Thunderbolts that refused to fight on expected terms. Leadership faced a hard truth: belief could not substitute for performance. For Japanese pilots, the shock was personal. The moment a Thunderbolt pulled upward and did not slow contradicted years of experience. Engines strained, controls softened. The gap widened instead of closing. What should have been a brief pursuit became a warning. Combat reports began to change in tone. Pilots noted American fighters that escaped vertically. Encounters described aircraft that could not be caught once they climbed. Language shifted from dismissal to caution. Confidence eroded quietly. Pilots who once initiated combat now hesitated. They assessed altitude more carefully. They abandoned pursuits earlier. This caution, while necessary, carried its own cost-ceding initiative to the enemy. The Zero's strengths had not vanished. It was still agile, still deadly in the right conditions. But those conditions were becoming rarer. American pilots increasingly refused to meet Japanese fighters where the Zero excelled. For Japanese aviators, this felt like betrayal by the sky itself. What had worked no longer worked reliably. Familiar tactics produced unfamiliar outcomes. Pride collided with physics. The Thunderbolt did not need to score kills to change behavior. It needed only to deny engagement on unfavorable terms. Each time it climbed away untouched, it reinforced a lesson no one wanted to learn: that the balance had shifted in air combat. Survival depends on adaptation. Pride is lethal at altitude. Belief that an opponent must behave as expected invites disaster. The Thunderbolt's climb rate punished that belief mercilessly. Japanese pilots faced a moral choice mid-air: pursue and risk loss of control, or disengage and accept disadvantage. Neither felt satisfying. Both required abandoning assumptions formed in earlier victories. Adaptation demanded humility. Some pilots learned, they broke off earlier. They avoided vertical traps. They saw conditions where their aircraft still held advantage. Others did not and paid the price. On the American side, survival carried its own discipline. Thunderbolt pilots resisted the urge to press downward into turning fights. They trusted training over impulse. They accepted disengagement as success, not failure. This restraint mirrored earlier lessons of air combat. The fight you refuse can be the one that saves you. The moral dimension was not about courage versus cowardice. It was about recognizing when the environment had changed. Technology had altered the sky. Those who adapted lived longer. Those who clung to belief did not. As these lessons spread unevenly across squadrons, encounters became sharper. The gap between expectation and reality narrowed, but only after shock forced recognition. And with that recognition came the decisive moments. Moments when Japanese pilots committed to pursuits they should not have made. Moments when the Thunderbolt climbed and did not stop. Those moments would define the turning point. The misunderstandings had collided with physics. Doctrine had met altitude, and in the sky above the Pacific, the next encounter would make the lesson unavoidable. March 1944, late afternoon, high over the Pacific. where the air thins and engines reveal their true character. The contact begins as a routine interception. Japanese fighter Zeros climbing hard spot the American aircraft below and angle in with confidence. The Thunderbolt's broad wings and heavy fuselage confirm what they expect. This is an aircraft to be drawn into a turn and finished quickly. The American pilot does not oblige. He holds course just long enough to fix the enemy's commitment. The fighters close. The distance narrows. Then, without drama, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt pitches up and begins a climb. Not a zoom, a sustained pull. Asterisk at first, the Japanese pilots follow instinctively. Throttles forward, nose up. The climb angle steepens. Seconds pass in the gap. Does not shrink. The Thunderbolt's exhaust remains steady. Its speed bleeds less than expected. The aircraft continues upward, converting momentum into altitude with a calm that feels wrong. The Mitsubishi A6M0S strain. Their engines lose bite as the air thins. Controls soften. The climb flattens. One pilot levels briefly to regain speed, then tries again, too late. The Thunderbolt is already higher, already dictating the geometry of the fight. A moment of indecision ripples through the formation. Pursue further and risk stalling. Break off and surrender altitude. The American pilot senses it. He does not roll over, does not dive back down. He keeps climbing patient, relentless until the Zeros peel away one by one. Forced to choose survival over pride, altitude now belongs to the Thunderbolt. From above, the American pilot resets the fight. He rolls gently, converts height into speed, and begins the descent on his terms. The Japanese pilots scatter, attempting to reform, but the rhythm is broken. The engagement has shifted from a confident interception to a reactive scramble. What shocks the Japanese pilots is not a kill. It is the realization that the aircraft they mocked has rewritten the rules mid-air. The weight they believed would doom it has become the source of its advantage. The climb they expected to win has exposed their limits. The Thunderbolt passes through the vertical plane again, bend down, never lingering, never turning. Each pass reinforces the same lesson. The fight will happen only where the Thunderbolt allows it. The encounter stretches on, brief but decisive. No prolonged turning, no horizontal chase. Just vertical separation and re-engagements that favor power over agility. And as the Zeros disengage to regroup, the American pilot climbs once more. Unchallenged, the turning point is complete. What began as mockery has become caution. What felt like certainty has become doubt, because now the Japanese pilots understand something they did not before. The sky has changed, and so has the balance within it. The second engagement begins differently. Japanese pilots no longer rush in with confidence. They climb cautiously, spacing out, watching the Thunderbolt rather than assuming its limits. The earlier pursuit has altered their calculations. What had seemed obvious now feels uncertain. The American pilot notices the hesitation. He levels briefly, just long enough to suggest vulnerability, then pulls up again harder this time. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt responds immediately. Power remains steady. The climb angle holds. The aircraft rises into thinner air as if it belongs there. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0 S, try to follow in pairs rather than as a group. One pilot commits, determined not to yield altitude again. His engine strains. The aircraft shudders slightly as lift decays. He feels it before he sees it, the Thunderbolt pulling away. Nose higher, speed bleeding slower. He breaks off. That decision triggers others. Within moments, the Japanese formation fragments. Some pilots dive to regain speed. Others hold altitude, unsure whether to pursue. The cohesion that once defined Zero squadrons dissolves into individual judgment calls. The Thunderbolt exploits the opening. From above, it converts altitude into speed and makes a single firing pass. The attack is brief, controlled, and decisive. The American pilot does not linger. He does not chase. He pulls up again immediately, trading speed back into height before any turning response can form. The Zeros scatter. What shocks the Japanese pilots now is not surprise, but inevitability. The pattern is clear. Every attempt to force a traditional engagement ends the same way. The Thunderbolt climbs, they cannot follow, and the fight resets with the American above them. The realization settles in quickly. This is not a flaw in technique. It is a limitation of machinery. Engines lose power. Lift decays. Physics does not negotiate. The Japanese pilots disengage fully, breaking contact and descending toward lower altitude where their aircraft perform best. The Thunderbolt does not follow. It remains high, secure in the vertical space it now controls. From that altitude, the American pilot watches the enemy retreat, defeated in the dramatic sense, but displaced. The interception has failed. The airspace belongs to him. The encounter ends without a prolonged dogfight, without a spiraling chase to the ocean. It ends with separation, one side holding the sky above, the other forced downward. That separation is the shock. Back at base, Japanese pilots will struggle to describe what happened. The Thunderbolt did not outturn them. It did not rely on surprise alone. It simply climbed beyond reach, again and again, until pursuit no longer made sense. For the Americans, the lesson is reinforced rather than discovered. Training works. Energy fighting works. Weight, when paired with power, is not weakness. For the Japanese, something more unsettling sets in. The certainty has been lost. The aircraft they once mocked cannot be forced into their preferred fight. The sky no longer behaves as it did in 1942. Vertical space once an afterthought has become decisive, and with that understanding comes a shift that cannot be reversed in midair. The turning point is complete, not because a zero falls burning, but because a doctrine fails silently, unable to follow where the fight has gone. The immediate consequences were subtle, but unmistakable. There were no dramatic wrecks spiraling into the sea, no flaming trails marking a decisive kill. Instead, the outcome registered in reports, in pilot behavior, and in the quiet recalibration of expectations on both sides. For the Japanese pilots who disengaged, the encounter lingered. In post-mission debriefings, familiar language failed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had not fought like an aircraft that could be forced into submission. It had refused the horizontal plane entirely. Pursuit had proven futile above a certain altitude. The climb had not slowed as predicted. Some pilots described the experience clinically: power loss at height, inability to close. Others were more candid, noting that the American fighter escaped upward despite its size. The implication was unsettling. Known rules no longer applied reliably. Commanders listened, but conclusions came slowly. Japanese air units were already under strain. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours. Aircraft losses were difficult to replace. In that environment, doctrinal overhaul was hard to execute. Adjustments tended to be local and informal. Avoid prolonged vertical pursuits, disengage earlier, draw enemies down. But those adjustments conceded something important. They conceded altitude. On the American side, result reinforced confidence. Thunderbolt, pilots returned with confirmation that training aligned with reality. Energy fighting worked. Discipline in refusing turning engagements preserved advantage. The aircraft's climb and power retention were not theoretical. They were decisive. Squadron leaders noted the pattern. Encounters where pilots trusted altitude and patience ended with control of the engagement. Those who broke discipline and chased turns risked unnecessary exposure. Maintenance crews. 2. Observed outcomes. Thunderbolts returned, scarred but intact. Engines ran reliably even after sustained high-power climbs. Structural integrity held under aggressive vertical maneuvers. These were not minor details. They validated the aircraft's design philosophy under combat stress. Across airfields in the Pacific, word spread quickly among pilots, not as propaganda, but as practical knowledge. The Thunderbolt was not a zero killer in the traditional sense. It was something different. It was an aircraft that denied the enemy what they wanted most: a predictable fight. The immediate aftermath then was not measured in victories claimed, but in engagements avoided, interceptions that failed, pursuits that broke off early, zeros that descended rather than followed. Airspace remained contested, but the terms had shifted, and as missions continued, those shifts accumulated. shaping the air war one encounter at a time. Asterisk. The longer-term impact unfolded across weeks, not days. Japanese fighter units did not abandon the Zero, nor could they. It remained numerous and familiar, and at lower altitudes it was still dangerous. What changed was behavior. Interceptions became more cautious. Pilots assessed altitude before committing. Vertical pursuits were shortened or avoided altogether unless conditions were clearly favorable. These adaptations carried costs. Breaking off earlier meant surrendering initiative. Drawing fights downward meant accepting delays while American aircraft climbed away and returned at will. The tempo shifted toward the Americans, who could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Doctrine tried to catch up. Briefings emphasized avoiding prolonged climbs against heavier American fighters. Leaders encouraged teamwork to trap opponents horizontally, but these fixes addressed symptoms, not causes. Without engines that could sustain power at altitude, Japanese pilots were constrained by physics they could not overcome. On the American side, confidence in the Thunderbolt hardened into habit. Pilots learned to trust the climb not as an escape, but as a position. They conserved energy, climbed early, and arrived above the fight prepared. Squadrons refined tactics that emphasized altitude discipline, short firing passes, and immediate vertical recovery. The aircraft's reputation changed accordingly. What had once been mocked for its size became respected for its reach. The Thunderbolt's presence altered Japanese planning even when no shots were fired. Zeros that avoided altitude surrendered escort opportunities. Bombers benefited indirectly, facing fewer aggressive interceptions from above. The arrival of additional American aircraft types and improved logistics accelerated this trend. But the lesson preceded them. Vertical control mattered. Weight, paired with power, could dominate space that agility alone could not hold. Reports reflected this shift. Japanese combat summaries increasingly noted difficulty engaging American fighters at higher altitudes. American after-action reviews emphasized altitude, advantage, and energy conservation. The language of air combat evolved to match experience. The war did not hinge on a single encounter, but encounters like this one multiplied. Each reinforced the same conclusion. Each nudged behavior, training, and expectation in a new direction. Over time, those nudges became momentum. By mid-1944, the Pacific Air War bore little resemblance to its opening months. The Zero's early dominance had given way to a contested sky where power, protection, and altitude decided outcomes more often than turning finesse. The Thunderbolt did not win that transformation alone, but it helped make one thing clear: appearances could deceive, and belief could be dangerous. The sky had changed, and the men who survived were the ones who accepted that. Change first. Air combat rewards clarity, not the clarity of reputation or assumption, but the clarity that comes from understanding limits of machines, of bodies, of air itself. The story of the Thunderbolt's climb is not about humiliation or triumph. It is about recognition. Japanese pilots mocked what they thought they understood. American pilots trusted what they had tested. When those two attitudes met at altitude, physics rendered its verdict without drama. Weight did not mean weakness. Agility did not guarantee control. The sky favors power used wisely. The Thunderbolt's climb rate shocked not because it was miraculous, but because it contradicted expectation. It exposed the danger of fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's assumptions. In that sense, the encounter reflects a broader truth of World War II. Technology moved faster than belief, and those who adapted first survived longer. For the pilots involved, the lesson was immediate and personal. A pursuit abandoned, an engagement avoided, a climb that could not be matched. These moments did not end careers in flames, but they reshaped behavior in ways that mattered just as much. History often remembers victories as destruction, but many victories are quieter. They look like separation rather than collision. They sound like engines pulling away. Rather than guns firing, they end with one side holding altitude and the other forced down. In the Pacific skies of 1944, that kind of victory accumulated until it changed the character of the war itself. The Thunderbolt did not need to prove it. Was light, It proved it was right for the fight that mattered, and in doing so, it reminded every pilot who faced it that the sky is not impressed by appearances, only by what an aircraft can do when the air grows thin and the climb refuses to end.